books in May, which from a quantity standpoint is pretty typical for me. But the quality was sky high. So I keep a running tally of my top 6 books of the year, because at the end of the year when I do my Red Fury Book Awards, I always have my top 6 books up for my book of the year. Well, 3 of those 6 books I read in May, at least up till this point. Some of them may not last by the end of the year, but as of right now, 3 of the best books I've read this month were in May. So I'm going to have those last. One of them will be Book of the Month. The other 2 will be right before it. And as always, I will have chapters below as well. So if you want to skip around, you want to skip a certain chapter, I group the reviews by genre, again with my top 3 at the very end. So let's start with a nonfiction work by John Steinbeck called Once There Was a War. This is a collection of Steinbeck's war dispatches. During World War II, he was embedded as a journalist, and he wrote these various dispatches, some from England, some from North Africa, and then some from Italy. And that's how the book is kind of organized, is just the way that these dispatches were published. So a collection like this rarely works because it's not meant to be in this form. It's meant to be these super short things that a journalist sends to a newspaper to be published. And when I say short, most of these are short. Most of these are like 2 pages. So there's really not a lot of narrative momentum in a collection like this. But it's also Steinbeck, so a lot of this worked really well for me, mainly because Steinbeck is just such a great writer. The first thing that is pretty remarkable in this volume is that a lot of the people that he writes about, they leap off the page just like his characters, because he is just so skilled at making. Obviously, if he can make a fictional character leap off the page, he can do the same with a real person. And I'd experienced that before. I have read another work of his that's nonfiction, that's his Travels with Charlie, which is fantastic. That one is stronger than this one. But he's very good at that, and I enjoyed that part of it. But then he does manage in some of the stories, particular towards the end of this, in the stories that were in Italy, a few of them kind of had a through narrative that kind of painted a deeper picture of the war and what he was able to see as a war correspondent. So those were pretty compelling. As a whole, it's a bit uneven, as any collection like this would be. You know, some of these dispatches are super short and not very memorable. Some of them work really well. So while this wouldn't be something that I would be a big, hey, everyone, you need to read this when I'm giving a Steinbeck recommendation, if you have read Steinbeck and you want to go deeper, again, this is probably not in my top half of things that I've read by Steinbeck, but I can still recommend it. The writing's solid. There was enough in here that I enjoyed, and it's pretty short, so it's not going to take a lot of your time. So I did enjoy Once There Was a War by John Steinbeck. Shadows of the Empire by Steve Perry is a Star Wars novel that's set between the movies The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And the kind of goal of the novel is to fill in some of the gaps, because we know that there's big gaps between those 2 movies. And from what I understand, there was also a comic book series of the same name that I think told some other stories to try to fill in these gaps between the 2 movies. And Perry does a very good job with this. The story itself is kind of mundane because there's not a whole lot going on. You can't tell a huge story between these 2 big films, but the story is pretty good. It's basically you have Luke and Leia and Lando and Chewie and everybody trying to figure out how to get Han back is kind of the main story. And then we also have kind of the side story from the other perspective. We get the Emperor and Darth Vader trying to find Luke Skywalker to potentially bring him into their mix. And then there's another character that you don't meet in the movies, who's Prince Shizor, who is head of the Black Sun crime syndicate. And he's trying to become the Emperor's kind of right-hand man, to the consternation of Darth Vader. So you get some rivalry in there. And overall, the story was fine. It was good. But the execution was very good. I thought in particular, one of the things that Perry did really well was the evolution of Luke Skywalker as a character. Because if you watch the films, you see the first film, he's a whiny kid. And then in the last film, he's this mature Jedi Knight. And while you do get some of that growth in the second movie, a lot of it doesn't happen really on screen. So I thought that Perry did a good job at showing how Luke is training as a Jedi with some of the things that Ben Kenobi left him to further his education and all of that. And I felt that he did a good job at just kind of evolving this character, because when we see Luke at the beginning of Return of the Jedi, he's a very different character than we'd seen at any point up till then. So I thought that was really, really well done. There are also some really great action sequences. There's one really good set piece at the end from Darth Vader's perspective that's downright chilling. Really, really good there. The story itself was good. I think the execution was better than the actual story, which made it enjoyable for me. Now, this was an audiobook listen, and I do have to mention, I have mentioned that I try to make sure that I talk about the narrator, because that does play into your enjoyment of an audiobook or not. And I have some misgivings about Mark Thompson. This is the second book of his that I've read. First of all, I'll say he is excellent. He's very good. He does voices really well. He brings the action to life, and he's a good narrator to listen to. But I do have a problem with some of his character voices. Prince Shizor was Ricardo Montalban. 100%. In fact, I was driving one day after work, and he said something evil, and I yelled, "Khan!" Because I thought it was... Anyway. So that's frustrating. But even beyond that, because that voice actually worked really well for the character, sometimes some of his side characters are 100% people that you know, and for me, it ruins the immersion. The previous book that I listened to with this narrator, John Wayne was a character. And every time John Wayne stepped in, I'm picturing John Wayne. Well, this book, there's only one scene with this character, but 100% Arnold Schwarzenegger was in this audiobook. So I will be a little more reluctant to seek out this narrator. Perhaps if some of the books that I really want to read in the Star Wars universe are narrated by him, I might just opt to read those ones with my eyes. I still love Star Wars audiobooks, but I just had to mention that this is something that did lower my enjoyment of Shadows of the Empire just a little bit. But overall, I would say Shadows of the Empire is probably in the top half of the 25 or 26 Star Wars novels I've read. Maybe not the top quarter, but I enjoyed my time with it. So next two books are in the fantasy genre. This is a low number of fantasy reads for me within a month, 2 out of 8. If you're one of my fantasy fans, just rest assured, next month there's a lot more fantasy on the docket. But I can review these two fantasy novels together because they're in the same collection. This is The White Wolf, which is the third volume of the Elric saga. So this is an omnibus by Michael Moorcock that contains 3 Elric novels, and I read the first 2 last month, The Dreamthief's Daughter and The Skrayling Tree. But I'll be honest, this being labeled as Elric Saga is kind of a misnomer, because at least these first 2 books, Elric is only kind of a main character for about a third of each book, if not less. It's more about the multiverse. For me, that means to its detriment. Leading into this, I'd read the previous 8 Elric novels, and I'm a fan. I really loved, especially The Bane of the Black Sword and Stormbringer, the last 2 in the second omnibus. Fantastic storytelling. I really enjoy it. I enjoy the character. But my least favorite one previous to this was the one that was all about the multiverse that he wrote later, that takes place in the midst of the earlier novels. And my problem with Moorcock's execution of his multiverse is that everybody is super aware of the multiverse, and they're always talking about the multiverse. And that continues here. The Dreamthief's Daughter started off with a lot of promise for me. It was not Elric, because again, he's not the main character. You get Ulrich von Beck, which is kind of a... Anyway, you can read and find out how he's related to Elric, but Ulrich von Beck lives in basically Germany during the rise of the Nazis. And what I thought was going to unfold was perhaps a really cool historical fantasy with... Elric or Ulrich or whatever fighting Nazis, that kind of thing. And it started off, I was really intrigued with that. It was a little surprising at first, but I thought I liked where the story was going. Well, and then about a third of the way in, it just turned into this multiverse where we're jumping around different planes of existence, and this little thing happens, and then this happens, and this happens. And it just lost my interest. But then the end of the book was super strong, like one of the strongest endings I think that he's written in his novels. So I was back on board. Like, okay, it meandered in the middle, but solid ending. Let's see what happens next. Even though I say solid ending, it was still maybe in the bottom third of my favorites of the Elric novels. Well, the Skrayling Tree, which is the 10th novel of Elric that I've read, is firmly number 10. I don't remember the last time that I was so disinterested in reading a book. And had it not been book two of a trilogy, book two of an omnibus that I was halfway through, it would have been my first DNF of 2026 because I just wasn't interested in the story that was unfolding. Again, it's not really an Elric story. He narrates a third of the story. It's in three different parts with three different narrators. But again, all it's doing is multiverse. And I found nothing personally from a plot, character, setting, or thematic standpoint that I found compelling. Maybe a little bit with character, just a little bit. But this was a huge, huge disappointment for me. 300 pages, it seemed like it took forever for me to read this book because anytime they started talking about the multiverse, the characters, I just kept rolling my eyes. I've been critical of like sometimes Brandon Sanderson's handling of his Cosmere connections in his books. I think it's worse here. So in general, Skrayling Tree was a huge disappointment. I didn't like the treatment, the way that because it's the albino in America is how it's the subtitle, which another thing to roll my eyes. And I didn't think the handling of Native Americans in it was very good, but overall, just a huge disappointing read. I will finish this. The third book is like 300 pages, so it may feel like it's long, but I mean, there were aspects of the Dreamthief's daughter that I really enjoyed, so maybe we'll get some of that in here. I'm going to go in with low expectations and hope that perhaps they'll be exceeded because the Dreamthief's daughter and the Skrayling Tree by Michael Moorcock, unfortunately, were disappointing reads for me. Sins of the Fathers by Lawrence Block is the first book in the Matthew Scudder series. This is a series following Matthew Scudder, who is a former NYPD detective who's now a private investigator. It's set in the 1970s in New York. And this is the second book of his I've read. Even though this is the first book in the series, I read 8 Million Ways to Die, which I think is the fourth book in the series. It is unbelievable. It's fantastic. One of the best works of crime noir I've read in several years. Highly recommend that one. And the reason I could read that first is if you don't read crime fiction of this type, most of these books are generally going to serve as standalone novels. So you can just kind of jump in anywhere. But since I did love 8 Million Ways to Die, I wanted to start back at the beginning with Sins of the Fathers. And in a book of this type, I mentioned this in a previous video where I was talking about the works of Michael Connelly. One of the things that the author has to do is establish the character of the main protagonist here, Matthew Scudder. And I found him very intriguing. I found him very interesting. He's very much a kind of a combination of two different archetypes. He's kind of the archetype of the detective who will do whatever it takes to solve the case, but he's also the archetype of maybe a little bit of an anti-hero. And I kind of like the blurry edges of this character, which I'm sure will be filled in later in this series. So I enjoyed getting to know him and especially getting to know the story behind why he's no longer a detective, because he's still friends with detectives. It seems like he was highly respected, and you get to see the backstory here. So Sins of the Fathers is pretty short. This is actually, I rarely finish 2 audiobooks in a month, but I finished this one as well, because it was only 5 hours, which leads me to believe the novel itself has to be well under 200 pages. And kind of the flaw of this book is that because it was so short, you got a very small character count. It was pretty predictable as far as was concerned. I didn't predict every aspect of the ending, but there was enough of it that, I got to the end like, yeah, saw that coming, which is disappointing because I think that's one of the joys for me in crime fiction and murder mysteries is when something unexpected happens and then you see that the author was just kind of leading you astray just so you would think something different was going to happen. And I didn't really feel that here. I didn't feel the execution was super high, but I thought the narrative voice is strong, the character is strong, the writing's far better than just being competent. So I'll definitely be reading more of these Matthew Scudder books, probably some with my eyes, some via audiobook, but I did enjoy Sins of the Fathers by Lawrence Block. All right, down to the top three, which were all fantastic reads this month. First one is another one in the crime fiction genre, and this is The Winter of Frankie Machine by Don Winslow. So this is a standalone novel by Winslow, and I've read 8 by him, and he hasn't missed yet, and this is super strong. There are 2 things that really impressed me with this book. One is Winslow is one of those authors that I just think creates characters and develops characters kind of effortlessly. Not just Frankie Machine, who is the main character. I think he's in every single scene and it's from his POV the entire time, but other characters as well. Some of these characters you only see for a page or two, and I feel they're vivid. And there were even a couple in the middle that you saw kind of character arcs in just a small amount of page time. And I thought they were done really, really well. So that aspect of the story I just really loved, because I just marvel at authors that can do that, where they don't have to give you a lot of exposition for you to really lock in and understand a character. The other thing that was done really well here is the plotting and the pacing of this book was done very, very well. In particular, one aspect. So there are a lot of times I've read in the last few years a book where you're getting a story about a character, and then when the author does a flashback and tells you something about the character's past, when it's not done well, it feels like the story has stopped so that the author can tell you this. But Winslow manages to weave that into the narrative here, where it feels like it's at the right time, it's the right length, and it doesn't feel like it stopped the main story, even though we're going back in time. And that's something that I wish I knew more about the technical aspects of writing so I could say how he does this, because I think it's quite masterful. Anyway, what's this about? This is about a long retired mob hitman, Frankie Machine. He's like 60 years old, I think, in this book, and he's thrown back into the life, and he has to find out why he's been thrown back into the life. And it's a very fast-paced story. It's about 300 pages, super short chapters, kind of stylized prose, and it'll keep you going from beginning to end. I don't know enough about Winslow's writing at this point, even though I've read 8 books. I mean, that seems like a lot, but I think this is a good entry point for him. The problem with an entry point with Winslow is I see that he writes in so many different styles within crime fiction. It's hard to just pinpoint a entry point. So let's call this an entry point, because you could start here. I really enjoyed my time with Frankie Machine, and it's one of my best books that I've read in 2026. Fall of Giants by Ken Follett is the first book in the Century trilogy. This is a chunky book, and this is a masterclass in plotting and pacing. In fact, there's some authors I've read in the last few years that I would like to just say, hey, go read Fall of Giants to learn how to write a book this thick, 900 pages, where the story never sagged, and this is a story that's spread out over 5 countries and dozens of characters, and not one time in this single book did I feel that we were too long with one character or too long away from a character. It seemed like every time that Follett just changed where the story was and took it to a different character's perspective, like, oh, it's time to check in with this person. It is truly, it's a masterclass in plotting and pacing, and it's probably one of the best books of this size in that regard. So Fall of Giants is first book of the Century trilogy, and this book takes place just before World War I. Again, it's historical fiction, if I didn't mention that. Just before World War I, through the war, and then a little bit after the war. And it follows primarily 5 families that are set in different places. We have a storyline in Wales, storyline in England, storyline in Germany, Russia, and the United States. And some of the storylines have more characters than others, and then some of them get more page count, but for the most part, it's spread across all of those places. And then some of the story takes place in some other places because, of course, with the war, there's some other things going on besides just those countries. The characterization was strong, but again, the plotting and pacing was a masterclass. It was really impressive that at no point did I feel like, wow, this is long, or man, can we speed up, or man, can we get back to this character? I felt like he just so intricately was able to weave so much of this story together in such an outstanding way. If I have one criticism, though, of this book, I didn't feel an emotional connection to most of the characters. So when kind of some big things happen, they didn't really hit me. I think Follett's been better in that regard in some of his other books. In some of his Kingsbridge books, he's been better at that. But from a plotting and pacing standpoint, I think he's at his best right here. This was so superbly done. If you want to hear more about this, I'm going to have a discussion on the channel this Thursday, 8 p.m. Central Time, with Kyle from Read by Kyle and Ian the Reader. We are buddy reading this series together. We had some good just chatter with each other, and we're going to have this talk on the channel on Thursday. We will start spoiler-free, so if you haven't read it, pop in and hang out for the non-spoiler section where we talk about it so you can hear more than just my thoughts about it, because all three of us really, really enjoyed this book. And then we'll dig into spoilers, so definitely if you've read it, please come out, hang out in the chat. We'd love to get your contributions to the discussion as well. So look for that discussion on Thursday. But again, one of the best books I've read this year was Fall of Giants by Ken Follett. My book of the month is This Day All Gods Die by Stephen R. Donaldson. This is the fifth and final book of the Gap Cycle, which is a grimdark space opera that I've read one book per month this year. And I'm so happy that this was book of the month, because if you follow me on Goodreads and you just pay attention to my ratings, this was the only one that got 5 stars in the series. The way that he was able to wrap up this series was magnificent. Impressive, extremely impressive what he was able to do. The series as a whole starts very small with a small cast of characters, really like 2 to 3 characters in the first book. Very small focus of the universe, and then just the series grows and grows and grows and becomes a kind of end of the universe type of story by the end, and dozens of characters. And he manages to somehow wrap it all up in a really impressive manner. I was honestly blown away by this book. The big complaint I'd had about the third and fourth books is as this world was expanding, the story was kind of stagnating and super slow. There were a lot of very circular chapters. I felt that Donaldson could have had a stronger editor in the middle of this series, but by the time he got here, man, just chef's kiss for this one. He gave us a really strong ending, a cathartic ending, and I can reframe kind of my thoughts about the entire series knowing how strong this finale was. So if you want to hear me talk more about this, I've already shot a video of the Gap Cycle, and it is 100% spoiler-free. I think it's about 20 minutes. I haven't edited it yet, but I talked for about 20 minutes, I think. So it's 100% spoiler-free. I took time to formulate my thoughts before that video so that I could make it spoiler-free, because there are things about the Gap Cycle that a lot of readers may want to avoid. And I'm going to answer kind of a big question about this series is, was it worth it? So look for that video. I'm going to put that one out next week. But Gap Cycle conclusion was fantastic. It really, really stuck the landing. Definitely excited to read more Donaldson this year and next year as well. I need to reread Thomas Covenant for sure. Maybe I'll do that next year as a major thing on the channel. But anyway, my book of the month, in a month that had some fantastic reads, is This Day All Gods Would Die. All Gods Would Die. No. This Day All Gods Die. Final book of the Gap Cycle. My book of the month for May 2026. So, hey, that was my month. If you've read any of these, let's chat in the comments section below. Just please label any spoilers for anybody that hasn't read those books. Again, look for my Gap Cycle spoiler-free review next week, and then come hang out for the Fall of Giants discussion Thursday night. Love to have you hanging out in the chat for that. And hey, what was your book of the month? Let me know that below as well. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.